Marketing Association
Sorry.
for organizing this and providing us the platform. Bill 64 is going to be presenting some new and unique challenges to marketers and businesses in general. And what we're going to do today is just talk you through what you need to do to be prepared for that and how to handle it. My name is Neil Beaton, by the way. I'm with DRT Cyber. We provide privacy and cyber security solutions. That's my background. I will be moderating today and presenting a little bit, but the lion's share of the heavy lifting will be done by my colleagues here, Derek Lackey and Constantine Karbaliotis. I will let them introduce each of themselves respectively. Maybe Derek first, if you'd like to go.
Sure. My name is Derek Lackey. I'm the managing director of Newport Thompson, and in my spare time, I'm the chairman of the Response Marketing Association, and been involved in privacy for about 10 years now, and come at privacy from a marketing point of view. So I'm more interested in operationalizing data protection and privacy than the nuances of the law, which Constantine has to constantly deal with. So over to you, Constantine.
Hello, everyone. My name is Constantine Karbaliotis. I'm counsel with Innovation, boutique privacy and data protection firm based in Ottawa and Toronto. My background is I've been a privacy officer for 2 multinational organizations. I've been doing privacy for about 18 years now in a variety of roles. And well, that's me.
Perfect. All right. Thanks very much, Constantine.
And you will notice as we go through this, Constantine's sense of humor is amongst the best amongst privacy pros.
Well, the bar too high. We'll see how well I do today.
Yeah.
There's your spotlight, Constantine.
Yeah, exactly.
Could you toggle down to the agenda, and I'll just let everybody know what we're going to talk about today very quickly, and then we can just get rolling. So we're going to keep it fairly simple in terms of what we're trying to cover in terms of the depth of it, but it's for practical application of the law is really what we're trying to get at. So we're going to start just at the very basics. Whom does the bill apply to? What's in scope? And then how do marketers make sure they get consent? And then how do you prove consent? So that's a very key thing. What is provable? What is auditable? Then we're going to talk a little bit about consumers' expectations, and we'll have a wrap-up summary at the end. The whole session is planned to be in the 45-minute ballpark with 15 minutes at the end for questions. Certainly, we're willing to take some questions in the middle of the presentation. If something comes up that's particularly pertinent to a point that's being made right at that point, we might take the chance to address it right then. But barring that, we will be taking questions at the end. And I just see a question coming up from Alan right now. Yes, I forgot to say there will be slides available at the end. Largely, the slide deck is going to be referential for you as an after the fact document. There's not going to be a tremendous amount of actual PowerPoint slide discussions here. There might be a couple of quick references, but Derek has prepared a deck that has extensive information and a lot more fulsome background behind this that we will happily provide for you.
And the session is being recorded, so you will be able to, we will send you links to the recording, so you'll be able to access the recording of the session if you want to replay any part.
Perfect. So the way we're going to do this is for each one of these topics, we'll just clock through each one of them, and we'll have either Derek or Constantine kick it off with the other one, or any of the three of us providing a little bit of extra information as we go, but just an overview by one individual to start with. So we're going to start with Derek on who does Bill 64 apply to?
Well, it's, I think as we said in the description, it's easy to get fooled and think that you have to have an office in Quebec, or that you have to actually be operating there. It's based on where the citizens whose personal data you're using resides. And right now, Stats Canada says that 22.5% of the population resides in Quebec, of the Canadian population. Therefore, any national list, I'm going to assert, has 20 to 25% of it is Quebec citizens. Therefore, Bill 64 applies. Now, one of the things I'd just like to underline here is Bill 64 affected 21 different Quebec acts. The one we're specifically dealing with here is the Public Sector Personal Information Act. It's called PPI.
Private sector. Private sector.
Did I say? Yeah.
You said public.
I apologize. It's private sector and public bodies is how the Quebec refers to it. And those two laws were dramatically impacted. Major changes, major overall. Many of the other 19 other acts that were affected were a few sentences here or there. But so for when we say Bill 64, what we're talking about for the purposes of this presentation is the public sector law.
Private sector.
Private sector. Thank you, Constantine.
Yeah, it's PPIPs and PPIPs. So doesn't really roll off the lips.
Right.
But just to add to, and again, just to make clear, I'm not a Quebec called lawyer, but one of the things that Bill 64 doesn't change is the definition of what an enterprise conducting business in Quebec is. So you would probably have been caught before by conducting business in Quebec if you have a reasonable nexus with which you are engaged with residents of Quebec.
Right.
Just as a way of contrast, when clients have talked to me about how they avoid being caught by GDPR, which also has extraterritorial application, it's come down to, and you may have seen some American companies going to these steps, not allowing people to order from Europe, or and putting geolocation on their websites, and not allowing processing of payments, for instance, from say Europe. And if somebody somehow sidesteps all of that through a VPN or something like that, well, they've sidestepped it. You're not conducting business in Europe, not providing goods or services to residents of the European Union. So you're not going to be caught by GDPR. I think that you have to sort of apply the same sort of thinking if you are, going to avoid the application of PPIPs. But the question really is, do you want to do that? As Derek pointed out, there's a quarter of the population. And the other area, I just want to make sure in terms of people understand application, that's sort of sneaky, is in relation to how you might well be caught by it because you're a supplier. If you're a supplier or a vendor to a company that's doing business in Quebec, you're going to find that there is definitely supply chain implications. And we can talk about that in terms of both how PIAs and transfers impact assessments have to be done. But they, just like with Canadian companies that found themselves having to rise to the challenge of GDPR because they're outsourcers or service providers, they're being caught by those requirements passed on contractually. So I want you to be aware that that is another avenue for which, even if you're not directly dealing with residents of Quebec, you might well be caught.
So this is, you sort of slid into the second part of this topic, which is the overall scope. So we've got the application, and now we're starting to look at a little bit more of the scope. And clearly the supply chain is an issue that you've got to be aware of, whether you're at one end of it or the other. You've got to know what the implications are for you.
One of the things that this law requires is if you are going to transfer Quebec residents' data outside of Quebec, you have to be accountable for the jurisdiction you're transferring it to. So if you're, for instance, sending it to the US, it is your accountability to understand what the US will or won't do with the data and determine whether it's the same standard as Quebec. So the onus is on the person.
Apply mitigations if the protections legally are not the same as what you would expect in Quebec.
Right, right. So it puts all the emphasis back on the person actually transferring the data. It's not like you could go like, well, I don't know what Quebec or what the US does with the data. It's your responsibility to find out before you transfer it to that jurisdiction. Is that correct, Constantine?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean,
And
there will be a
it
list developed of,
yeah,
it seems, of acceptable jurisdictions, but that's nowhere near being, done. And
right.
also the application of this is, I believe, September 2023
Mhm.
for those. So again, you have some time. I mean, I think one of the themes we want to develop in this conversation is don't wait, because a lot of these steps are going to take some time in order to be able to do them. So, get started now would probably be the general advice, but
Yeah, well,
there's
it,
some
it,
assessment required.
one of the things I think they did really, I think smart and pro business is they allowed 3 stages of coming into force. So this September, certain aspects will come into force. Next September, the bulk will come into force, and then the following September in 2024, the last piece will come in. So I thought it was interesting, and the last piece is data portability, which is probably the most complex to sort out. So we've got literally 3 years from the time the bill was passed to figure out data portability. But as Constantine said, our advice is to start taking chunks of it now. And in specific, and we'll go through this, is let's start looking at what's coming into force this September, because that's you could be violating the law as of September 22nd.
Yeah, and so a key aspect that we want to address here, and you can see it just in the topic, is the whole notion of consent, which is fundamental to the law. So maybe Derek, you'd already mentioned that you take a sort of an operational view of things from a marketing and a legal or compliance standpoint. Maybe you want to kick off this discussion about how marketers actually get consent from an operational standpoint. How do they do their jobs day to day and comply with the law?
Yeah, well, yeah, it's a bit of a catch-22 at the moment, I believe. If you look at what happened when GDPR came in, they allowed 3 different basis of processing, lawful basis of processing under the GDPR. You had a choice of consent, contractual, and what they call legitimate interest. And legitimate interest is a 3-part test, a weighing test, that it's in the best interest of your company to do X with the data, and it doesn't infringe too much on the personal rights and freedoms of EU citizens. Therefore, and you've thought it through and documented it, you've actually done a legitimate interest assessment on categories of data, and unfortunately, for some reason, Quebec left legitimate interest out. 95% of the business being done in the EU under the GDPR is done as legitimate interest. And we don't have that option here. So the only option we're going to have to use people's personal data is consent or contractual. And there's a few exceptions. But the exceptions are nowhere close to what they were proposing in Bill C-11 to update PIPEDA, our federal law. So, we're very concerned that that in this environment where the consumer doesn't trust most businesses with their data, that consent's going to be a little more difficult to get until we settle down on the abuse of their data and they start trusting us again. And that'll be brand by brand. But certainly changing all your web forms where you collect data to include the proper language. So one of the things you have to do is the consent has to be specific. It's got to be for a specific purpose. And you cannot use the data. So the example I frequently use is when you go into a retail store and they ask for your email address so they can send you a receipt, and then they add you to their promotion list. That's now illegal. The purpose that they asked you for it is different from the purpose they're using it for, and you have to go back and get additional consent to add them to your promotional list.
Or they
So
would have
it's
to change their process with their
One-
tellers to say, advise you or ask for consent for the actual marketing piece, to include that in their operational process.
correct. Correct.
And implied consent is still a thing. However, it's got to be very closely linked again to the activity. So as you know, the example, Derek used, the one I sort of like to use is, you're a bedding company, you sell beds. You need, of course, the address in order to deliver the bed. So that's within the context of a transaction, and it is fairly straightforward. The moment you start asking, that you want to use it now for marketing purposes, you're going to need a separate and express consent,
Right.
so that it's clear what you're signing up for. Also, I think that the further away you get from that original purpose, the more clear you have to be, and you will probably have to ask for separate, again, express consents. So if now I want to share it with a third party, maybe that's a separate checkbox. So it is going to become, and implied has certain operational challenges. How do you prove it? And yet, it's possible in the context of, say, delivery facility, basically logistics, to see how you can work that in so that it's clear. You need obviously an address in order to deliver. However, again, the more things you propose to do with the data, the more clear you have to be about each separate use.
And one of the things that we need to be conscious of too is we're early stages. So they've passed the law, but they have clearly stated at several points in the law that there could be regulations, and we believe there likely will be additional regulations get published by the CAI, which is the information commissioner in Quebec. CAI, it's referred to as CAI in the privacy community.
So we did have a question come up from Alan there. I don't know if you guys saw it, but he was asking what the definition of is a consumer under the law, and whether or not what sort of distinction there might be with regards to B2B versus B2C.
Great question, Alan. Yeah, and there is a cutout that they do not consider somebody's business email, business address, business phone number, and title and role. They do not consider that personal data under PPIPS.
You're still subject to CASL, regardless.
Very good. Good distinction, Constantine. CASL's still in play federally. So, but the fact is, there's a little bit of a carve out for B2B players who are dealing business to business, but you have to be careful, because a lot of people, even signing up for this webinar, the 80 people who signed up, I would say half of them used a Gmail address. So, right.
So yeah, no, you have to be careful and can't make assumptions.
Yep.
And again, CASL still applies. The exception's a little bit wider than what's currently exists under PIPEDA, because it's not limited to, like, if you put your email address out there and people contact you within the context of doing business, then that's okay. But if you step outside of that, even there, you can get in trouble. So it's a little bit wider. Going back to Derek's earlier point, in Europe under GDPR, and this is the big thing that I think we should really be paying attention to as Canadians, legitimate interest is far more frequently used. There are about 6 different lawful bases for processing data, and including the 3 that Derek mentioned. But what the regulators have said there is that consent should be the last basis on which you rely. And then, that should set the tone really for how really pragmatically you've got to have other bases. The other thing too is, this is not a consumer oriented law like the erstwhile attempt to reform PIPEDA was, where the word consumer appears in the title. This is also applicable to individuals who are employees. So you got to think individuals, not necessarily consumers. And so that has somewhat broader implications, because it's not necessarily a consumer relationship you need to have.
Right. A good distinction. Previous laws did not include HR information. They've now bundled it in as the GDPR has, right? This law in Quebec is very GDPR-like, but it in some areas even tougher. And one of the key areas is that lack of legitimate interest. Most direct marketing in the US or in the EU is done under the banner of legitimate interest. And you know, we're still a bit hopeful that in the regulations they bring some kind of ability to freely do business in, because as Constantine says, the last thing you want to do under the GDPR is depend on consent. There are other ways to go about it before consent comes in, because consent in this marketplace is going to be difficult to get because of the mistrust that has been built up over the last 20 years with the public.
I would say it's also going to be a logistical challenge, because we also have the experience of what happened when everyone tried to update their marketing lists under Castle. Write to somebody and they say, can we have your consent? And nobody responds.
Right.
And then you kill your marketing list. So, I mean, there's strategies in what you're going to have to do in order to make sure that you refresh and make sure that you don't kill your list again. This happened again under GDPR. They didn't learn from us in Canada and our experience. Everybody may remember in 2018 getting 1 million emails saying, can we have your consent? How many of you actually responded? So I think that there's going to be some practical implications as to how you approach this, because if you ask the question and you don't get a response, you've got to assume what? You don't have consent. One other feature you have to be aware of is express consent is required for sensitive personal information. So the minute that you start getting into those categories, and this is another area where it somewhat mirrors GDPR in terms of special categories of data. So sensitive personal information, and which includes financial and health and so on, is going to be something that you've got to be conscious of, because you will not be able to rely on any kind of implied consent in that case. And there's going to be higher expectations around what you're going to do to protect that information. So there are also nuances in terms of what the law requires, that you won't be able to really do a one-to-one mapping with GDPR and say, well, we've done this, we're okay in Quebec.
Correct.
Oh,
Correct.
one more thing.
I did say GDPR like, not
yes,
right.
Not a, yeah. One more thing. Consent is only valid for the time necessary to achieve the purpose. So unlike GDPR, another difference is that consent has got an expiry period on it, which again now means you've got to start thinking about how you engage with customers to make sure that you have that refresh taking place so that you can actually continue to communicate, continue to rely on that information. GDPR does not have that time limited, time limit. Processing is also without consent has to be for a purpose consistent and having a direct and relevant connection with the purpose for which it was collected. GDPR, on the other hand, says that you can process it for secondary purposes as long as they're not incompatible. So again, GDPR has a broader sort of exception for secondary uses. Again, you've got to really think this is a consent-focused law, and you're going to have to manage that consent very, very well in order to be able to allow, whether you get to, as Derek's pointed out, the, sort of inherent consumer mistrust, or as I pointed out, the sort of, laziness everyone has in terms of just clicking okay, you got to think very carefully about how you're going to preserve your ability to communicate with people when it's time limited, and it's got to be very closely tied to the original purpose, unless you can get another express consent. So it's got to be very careful thinking about how you approach people, how you build that trust, and also, and Derek, you probably want to go into this, how you prove it.
Yeah, and that's exactly where I was going to go. Like in the past, none of us have had to prove consent. So very few of us have a process in place to prove consent. And to me, that's one of the biggest challenges of this law is how do you prove consent? And there's a new breed of automation kicking up called preference management centers, which I think are going to be an absolute must for most brands, where you allow the consumer to go into a portal and you have your consents all broken down into sections and categories, and you ask for specific consent to do a whole bunch of different things. So within email, for example, you ask, what would you prefer? Weekly update newsletter. No, okay, turn that off. Good deals. Okay, I want that. Turn that on. And when you empower the consumer or the public to actually set their own preferences, and they're hardwired into where you keep data. So in other words, when I change my email preferences in your site, it goes right to MailChimp or whatever email service provider you're using, and it instructs MailChimp of what my email preferences are. So those kinds of preference management tools are going to be table stakes in these new data protection and privacy times.
Not only to prove, but also to offer the granularity that's going to be required in order to evidence that you have got the kind of consent that you're asking for the specific purposes again. So this is going to become an information management problem, clearly, a recording problem, and also how do you get people to actually use it? What's interesting, just as another contrast, in California, changes, I'll say CCPA, CPRA together, really contemplate the idea that we can be had for money. So, that, consumers can actually be bought or encouraged through loyalty or other programs. So I think it's going to require some greater creativity to say, and we see it happening, can we do this if we give you this? So I think that incenting people is going to become a bigger part of the strategy to get them to give up that information, provided, again, there's no, and I think this is a general truism, regardless of what law you're trying to comply with. You can't let people feel like they're going to be surprised or hurt by the uses of information that you're proposing to use. There should be, some clear understandings, and you need to really, I think, even more heavily rely on just-in-time notices, because, I'm a lawyer, but I got to say it's very tiresome to read a 30-page privacy notice and think that anyone is going to be able to glean anything from it. We've got to be a little bit more clear about what we're doing. And that means at the point in time that we want to do something with, say, a particular kind of information, we let them know. And we let them know what the potential consequences are too. So this requires obviously some, again, careful thought. We often are doing this on very small screens, so that's also a limiting factor. But again, how do you create defensible consent strategies? This is really, I think, the main impact of Bill 64 is you've got to defend your processing of the personal information, that you've obtained consent properly, that it's clear and unambiguous. And again, not 30 pages worth of, legalese. Oh, by the way, it should probably not have to be said, but we are talking about Quebec. It's got to be in French. You have to be able to produce your policies in French too. That's also part of the picture of terms of transparency. You need to be able to have your policies easily available, accessible, so that people can, in fact, go and look and see what is it you're doing with your personal information. So transparency, integrity, trustworthiness is going to become the hallmarks, I think, of how you approach a consent strategy.
and clear and honest choice, Constantine, right?
Yes.
Like you literally have to give the person, it's got to be as easy to say no as it is to say yes. You cannot, we've used all sorts of tricks to extract people's email and their title and in the past, and no more tricks. It's like, just be honest. What data you want, what you're going to use it for, and how long you're going to keep it. Just be honest. So
Yeah.
both a clear statement of purpose, as well as a possible hint at retention period. Obviously e-commerce, you require, CRA requires you to keep financial records for 7 years. So that's your retention period for any e-commerce data. And the rest you can make up based on, you have to have a sound rationale for it. And one of the things we recommend to clients when they're doing their data inventory, what data do we keep on people, is one of the columns in the spreadsheet that we absolutely insist on is, what's the retention strategy? How long do you plan to keep that for, and why that time period? So in the case I just used with the e-commerce data, CRA sets that standard of 7 years. So you're required to keep it for 7 years under the Revenue Canada rules.
Well, you've got to be very conscious of your retention requirements. And I think that's another area where you have now got a positive obligation to actually get rid of stuff. And, in marketing, there hasn't been typically a retention period applied, right? Because it has not fallen into clearly some of the other categories where it's easy because it's tax information or employee records, or, if you're in regulated industries, there's a host of different regulatory obligations around retention. But on the marketing world, it's been a free-for-all. We just keep everything forever. Oh, another key thing is that further, you can't rule, there are some exceptions to consent, but what is clearly out of bounds is that further processing of data for commercial or philanthropic prospection, read analytics, okay, is not permissible. So you cannot rely on implied consent for that stuff. You've got to actually ask.
Okay.
I think that's going to be a significant, and that's where I know Derek is hoping for some regulatory qualifications that are going to allow at least some processing. But right now, again, given how consent-based this law is, I think marketers are going to have to be, again, very clear to get permission to do the things that they want to do and be able to persuade consumers, persuade individuals to actually part with that data.
So I'm going to just jump in here for two quick things. We've got some housekeeping stuff. There's been a few things come up on chat. I'm just letting you know we're keeping track of that. Yep. And David Stark also asked a question not too long ago. It's actually kind of related to what you're just addressing right now, Constantine. So I'm just going to throw it in
there. Okay, so there's the constant battle between Quebec and the federal government. And, I will tell you that there are federally regulated organizations in Quebec that seem to somehow find themselves answering to the CHI regardless. And, how to best explain this? I think that there will be impact.
Sorry, Constantine, I don't know if everybody's read the question if they haven't clicked on it.
Sorry. Does Bill 64 apply to personal information that's collected by federally regulated companies like airlines, banks, telecom, et cetera? And so I would say technically it should not be the case that, they are federally regulated and under PIPEDA. However,
if those people live in Quebec, then they're in scope, Constantine.
Well, it's possible that we're going to have, dual application. But no, really, federal should oust it. This is not a case of like in in Alberta and BC, where there's concurrent jurisdiction for areas like, the federal jurisdiction is ousted when the provincial law is put in place and it's recognized as substantially similar. However, federal still applies to federally regulated bodies as well as interprovincial or international transfers. International and interprovincial transfers is a case of concurrent jurisdiction. But I have never read it to be concurrent. The problem is that there is going to be a contest, I suspect.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there's also going to be some maybe questions as to, is the function that's being performed by even a federally regulated body, does it fall within the provincial jurisdiction? Because we know that that happens in cases of, for instance, employment law in certain circumstances. So it will depend. I think that this is an open question. And what inevitably happens in Canada is it will go to the Supreme Court. So I'm going to say I believe that it should not apply to federally regulated bodies, but I think that it will probably be a contest, and it will have to be something that will have to be argued in front of the CHI and potentially the courts.
Great. So I'm just going to jump in because we sort of got away a little bit. It was good getting onto that, answering those questions, and it flowed that way. But I want to bring it back to how do marketers do this and how do businesses manage consent? And Derek, you gave an example of preference management centers, and we've also given examples of collecting consent live from a teller or whatever. So there's really two ways that you can collect and manage and track consent. That's either internally with employees doing it with the system that they populate, or with a customer-facing system like a preference center. And I'd just like to show everybody just a quick example of what those two things might look like. So I'm just going to share my screen really quickly here. And okay, everybody see that now?
Yep.
Yes. Okay, so this is an example of a screen that's put together by a company called Serenus with their product Cassie. And that is Serenus, or Cassie, is a preference management and consent management system. I don't know how well you can see this. The writing's pretty small, but strategically chose Scotch whiskey as the subject here. Macallan, no preference, just had to pick one. But basically what this does is it allows Macallan to offer their customers the ability to pick and choose who they hear from and what they hear about and where from. So basically, there's a clean statement up at the top, just welcoming people and saying what they're doing. It mentions that you're giving permission for communication, and then it just jumps right into it. What do you want to hear about? And it gives you options to select what sort of information you're most interested in hearing about. Then it gives an option of what regions are relevant to you. What are you most interested in from a regional standpoint? And then finally, again, just in this very simple example, the question becomes, how do you want to hear from us? And so this is an example of a nice, simple, clean preference center that allows customers to actively select how they want to hear from you and what they want to hear from you and when. And so,
and a good preference management center like Cassie has the ability that you can determine what these groupings are. So you could say, all right, here's our communication with you, but we also have a whole section here on how we profile you, how we collect information based on your interactions with us, and is it okay if we profile you just within our site and within your transactions with us, and get consent for things like that. So you can break it down many different ways, and a good preference management center allows that kind of flexibility for what categories, how you want to structure your categories and your consents.
And also what it does is it provides a centralized system of record for all of these consents.
Yeah.
So as again, Derek alluded to MailChimp and that sort of thing. These systems, when they're properly implemented, allow all of those systems to access the same consent records, so that you've got one single source of the truth that is the system of record for consent across the board. And to give you another quick example of what that might look like.
Yeah, while you're getting that up, one of the things you have to realize is that when CHI comes to you to investigate, they're likely not looking at your consents today. They're looking at your consents 6 or 12 months ago. So they give you a specific date and say, what consent did you have from Neil Beaton on June 20th, 2020? Because that's the period they're investigating. And you have to be able to prove what consents you had from Neil Beaton on that date. And
Yep.
and it can't be, I think, it can't be, yes, for sure we have Neil's consent, but I don't know where it is.
Or to what?
You have to prove it. Yeah.
You
Or to what?
actually
Yeah.
have to have version control here.
Yeah.
You know?
Absolutely.
Exactly.
So you want an audit trail that never erases and never gets overwritten. And
Correct.
Cassie does that.
Correct.
Another example is what I'm just going to show you very quickly here is Raven. It's one of DRT Cyber's products. It's for managing consent and email. And just very quickly, without getting into the detail, if I send an email to somebody I don't have consent for, the system is set up to let me know that I'm going to need to assign consent. So when I do that, I get an email sent to me, and this is what it looks like. It just says your consent's required. And if I just scroll down, I can click here to manage the consent. And then it takes me to a page that is not dissimilar from the preference center. But again, this is the employee populating the consent record. And then I can go in here, and this is all based on Castle consent. Again, this is related to email primarily. If I select express consent, I know it's not going to expire. If I select either a B2B or a B2C, it's a 2-year window. The system tracks all of that. And again, it's all centralized, and it can also talk to the other systems like your CRMs and your MailChimps so that the consent records are all managed. I can add additional information here, if it's express consent because I'm at a conference, basically, and I can upload a snapshot of a business card, all of that sort of stuff. So you're creating a consent record. And then again, this goes into a database that is centrally managed and is auditable and provable at all times, and it's never overwritten. So those are just 2 quick examples of what it looks like for both an internal and an external facing consent management system, how to do this for managing your business. I will stop sharing my screen right now. And I think you need to start yours again, Derek, if you want to just pick up again.
I will do.
So let me just look at chat. Do we have any more that came through just while Derek does that? Okay, so I'm just going to say we're going to circle back on these chats after, because we're getting very close to the 45-minute mark. Maybe if we can just have a quick look, Derek, at consumer expectations as the next topic before we slide into more Q&A and answering, going back and looking through some of these chats and taking any new questions that come up.
Yeah, one of the things we've noticed in the privacy community is that when one country brings a law in that grants specific rights to the consumer everywhere thinks they have those rights. So when GDPR brought in the right of access to your information, all of a sudden in Canada, access requests went up.
We always had those rights.
We did, but nobody exercised them because nobody was aware.
And privacy offices in major companies in Canada have seen a spike in requests that, and it's not the volume necessarily, it's the complexity. But there's no question that sorry, I'm going to interrupt just one second.
That's cool.
Microsoft implemented its GDPR compliance to be able to answer access requests and decided they would just do it globally because they had they didn't have multiple systems. They had typically one system serving globally. And why create the risk of errors when you have to try to decide based on where the data subject resides?
And just meet the highest bar, right?
Yeah, we're just going to do it for everybody. So where did most of the access requests come? From the United States, where there are no access rights, and there haven't been typically until state laws started getting passed.
Right.
So the heart of this is consumer expectation. Sorry, Derek, I'm jumping.
That's good.
It's really what matters because everyone expects to be treated a certain way now, and the law is almost secondary to that expectation.
Yes, I've referred to this as the great consumer awakening regarding privacy. people are beginning to understand that it's not about, you know, my email getting out there. It's about me controlling what can be done with my email address or my personal information. That's the relevance of this. It's like you can't just take it. Like we just saw this data scraping get shot down in court, which I'm sure you noticed,
Well, it
Constantine,
wasn't
right?
shot down. It was upheld, right? LinkedIn failed to stop the data scrape.
That's what I mean. That
Yeah.
blocking them got shot down.
Got shot down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they basically said that somebody could scrape data off LinkedIn and it's legal.
Well,
And
you see,
it's like
the problem is that's
when I give my
LinkedIn.
data to LinkedIn, it's for a specific purpose. Somebody's scraping it, and they're way outside of purpose limitations based on what they want to likely do with it, including selling it. Therefore, they don't have consent. They like.
Okay, so it's important to remember actually who brought the action. It was LinkedIn.
Yes.
So vis-a-vis LinkedIn and the web scraping company, they were unsuccessful.
Yes.
I would argue that, especially under Quebec's new law, under GDPR, that vis-a-vis the individual, the data subject, that web scraping is not quite so legitimate. And in fact, we've had some clear decisions around this with Clearview AI, where the scraping of people's photographs off the web was not considered by our commissioners or by regulators in Europe to be within the bounds of acceptable use. There was no consent. Correct. So this is something that, again, it depends on who's bringing the complaint and the context. But at the same time, we need to be cognizant of the fact that when we create these data stores, we create an attractive target, sometimes for web scrapers, sometimes for malicious actors. And that's got to be part of our risk assessment, because what really came out of Cambridge Analytica, the scandal, and the use of individuals' information that was being collected is that personal information can be weaponized. It could be weaponized against our democracies. It could be used in ways that you, as a marketer, aren't anticipating, won't profit from. And yet you're going to be held accountable by your consumers because this you enabled it. So you've got to think about how you're going to use data in a much more strategic way and ensure that you keep that trust, because again, consumer expectations are really paramount now.
Yeah, the other thing to underline here is Quebec, like they did in 1993, they were the first to volley a law out there. There are going to be other provincial laws, and there are going to be changes to PIPEDA, our federal law, and the Privacy Act on the government side. There are going to be changes to them in the next couple of years. So get out ahead of it. Start thinking about how you're going to track and record consent starting right now. So you have, under the Quebec law, until September 2023 before you'll be fined regarding consent. But that's a good window to start getting your systems, changing your practices, getting consent in a meaningful way, in a way that meets the standard of the law, right? So
in a way, again, the same way Microsoft approached GDPR, you're going to want to think about doing this more comprehensively, regardless of
globally. Yeah.
The federal law is probably going to be changed. Ontario has a draft, consultation paper that looked actually perhaps more to the Quebec model than the federal model in terms of what to do. BC and Alberta are chomping at the bit to update their laws. So, there's going to be changes. And of course, if you're doing anything in the US, you must be aware of California and the increasing number of states that are passing laws down there.
Utah just passed one. Yep.
So there's going to be more and more regulation, and you are going to have to rise to the challenge. And this is not something that's going to wait till September 2023 to get after.
And as Neil said, go to the highest bar.
Right.
So if GDPR is the highest bar in this particular category,
Well, Quebec
Right?
may be putting a
Yeah.
different sort of
Yeah,
bar
yeah.
in place on the consent side.
That's for
I
sure they
think
are.
we
Yeah.
really need to be. Now, I will say one other thing when we can wrap this up in terms of where GDPR is going. I mean, there are cases now being presented, especially challenging some of the larger tech companies, where that, sort of I consent, I agree button, which is consenting to a whole host of things, is being challenged under GDPR as not being real consent. So you see, in one way, it's still coming back to maybe what's explicitly being set out in Quebec's law, and that is you need to be granular, you need to be clear, and you can't bundle a whole bunch of stuff into one agree button. And I think that while that's not explicitly set out in GDPR, you have to be aware of the court decisions, the regulators' approaches, because they are driving a much higher degree of accountability. And I think this is going to be, again, true the world over. So do we want to get to some questions now?
Yeah, so I'm just going to jump into the chat. As I mentioned, there's two avenues here for the people that are listening out there. You can either go into the Q&A or in the chat. We've had people in both. I'm just going to scroll back through the chat. And one of the questions that came up that Constantine actually answered on the fly, but I'll just put it out there in case people haven't read it, was what happens when there's a European head office doing business in Canada? Is that company implicated based on where the consumer is resident? And Constantine gave the nice short answer, literally, yes, residency of the data subject is what matters. So
that is the same with the GDPR.
Right.
It's the same with PIPEDA.
It is. It's to protect the citizens in their jurisdiction. It's not about where your business is located or any of that crap.
Yeah,
it's
castle's the same. Yeah.
You don't even need physical presence, right?
Right.
So
okay, there's another question regarding preference centers. Do you know what the? Sorry, go ahead, Constantine.
I'm going to jump in and answer that. So it's about the complexity of preference centers. When Microsoft first
just to finish the question, if people aren't reading it, there's a risk of consumers getting turned off as there's too much to go through, and then you risk not getting the consent that you're looking for in the first place. So that's the nature of the question. Go ahead, Constantine.
And Microsoft ran smack into this because initially they gave you this incredibly granular sort of, I want to sign up for this, I don't want to sign up for that. And they eventually sort of collapsed it into, I want to turn everything off, I want to be more granular. And, that is going to become a question of design and style and understanding your consumers. Because you, again, like with everything, if you present people with too much, they're going to get turned off. You need to be able to get to the heart of what matters. When I was at Symantec, I discovered that we killed most of the complaints that were coming to us by just putting a big unsubscribe button, because that's what the most common complaint was. When you had software being bundled on laptops and computers, just tell me how to turn it off. When I got them to put a button on the privacy page, it said, click here to unsubscribe, the complaints dropped off. Yeah. So
and that actually rolls right into the next point that was raised by Trevor. Very nice segue. The expense of fines is often beside the point. It's the expense of dealing with complaints and responding to an inquiry that's the bigger concern. So there you go.
Absolutely. Yeah. If you look at when Castle started to be enforced, the true expense to Rogers wasn't the $250,000 fine. It was the cost of the investigation over Christmas, by the way, where they had to bring all kinds of staff back into the office. They had to prepare all the documents that the investigator wanted. That was hugely expensive. And then even the follow-up, because every time there's a fine, there is a order to come into compliance. So you're going to have to do the work anyway. So, right? Rather do it up front, save the fine, and treat your customer and the public with respect. We have to stop disrespecting the public. I can't believe that marketers are at a point where the laws have to tell them to take care of their customer. It's like, my God, how did we get here?
That's another cost, right? It's the cost of being in the headlines, right?
Reputational
risk.
Absolutely.
And
You
marketing
just mentioned
people-
Rogers. Everybody knows Rogers. The Gap just got hit for Castle as well. Nobody
Right.
wants to be that headline. There's a lot of cost associated
I'm
with
going to
that.
provide another answer to the question about preference centers and complexity and what it should look like. Marketing people are really good at asking people what they think.
Mhm.
Why don't you actually test it out with consumers, right? See what works for them. And that way, you know, you've got a really defensible position when the Kai calls you and say, well, how did you create this? We asked our customers. What a remarkable concept. It's just like,
Yeah.
oh, it's actually pretty clever. Why more people should do that? I'm just
Right.
going to give that to you as a freebie right now,
Yeah.
because you know, we often, and it can, especially, I mean, we haven't talked about PIAs and transfer impact assessments. One of the things, and I wrote recently in our blog, is, you know, we are operating sometimes in a bit of a what's the word, sandbox? No, like a, you know, closed environment where a bunch of people inside the company sit around and think, well, what's the right way to approach this PIA, or how do we get consent? And, you know, it's an echo chamber. That's the word I was looking for. We really should ask people, right? There are experts we can ask about UI. There are experts we can ask about data analytics. There are experts we can ask, we could ask our consumers what they think of these uses of data. What do they think of the way in which we're communicated? Does this sound creepy to you? That's going to be where you're going to get ahead of this game. And then as you're documenting the fact that you sought input, you now have a defensible position to a regulator. I know it's going to sound crazy to ask people their opinion, but you know, maybe we're.
And what Constantine's pointing at with documentation, that's all. Quebec has brought a whole new level of documentation and records of processing to the table. You need to do data protection impact assessments. You need to do transfer assessments. You need to have policies and procedures in a written format, so that it's if the Kai comes in and asks for your policies and procedures and you can't give them your manual, like literally, then here's your fine, because it's one of the requirements of this new Bill 64 is that you have documented policies and procedures. And that's every company. That's there in California, they did a carve out that you had to be doing 25 million or more, or you had to keep 50 million records or more.
50,000 households, yes.
Yeah. In Quebec, they didn't do that. So it applies to everybody from a 2-employee hairdresser to Air Canada. Right?
This is the other way even federally regulated companies are going to get caught by this. For instance, if you're doing business with a Quebec-based business that is directly under the law, how are they going to present you their expectations? Contractually. So, you know, it's going to come down to you if you're doing a B2B, because just like with GDPR, you're going to see a whole raft of contractual obligations arrive on your doorstep. And you're going to have to support doing that privacy impact assessment.
Yeah. So we've got 2 minutes. Yeah. So, you know, I think that one of the things that we should make folks aware of, that the key things that are coming into force this September, that you need to get on right away. One is that your CEO, or the highest authority in the organization, is now your privacy manager. They can delegate tasks around privacy to an employee or a contractor, but they are fully accountable. The CEO, the highest authority in the organization, is fully accountable for what's done with personal information within that company. So that's a key. Then the second thing that's coming into force in this September is a confidentiality incident reporting plan. You have to have a documented reporting plan complete with a registry of all security and privacy breaches. And they have to be logged, so that when Kai comes to you and says, can I see your log of confidentiality incidents, and you don't have one, again, it's going to be, here's your fine. it's interesting that they picked those two things first, because I think that bringing the C-suite to the table was a brilliant move, but also it appears they want to try to get a handle on these security and privacy breaches that are
They've had some very public ones.
right.
It's on the public's mind.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
And those
So-
aren't going anywhere anytime soon. Those
But-
are just going to increase.
Yeah, but also, start thinking about how you're going to manage consent going forward, because don't wait till next September to address it. Start thinking about it within your organization. We all have different cultures and we all have different industry practices within the sectors we operate in. Consider in your environment, how do you want to manage consent, and start getting to work.
Anything from you, Constantine? Last words with about
Just
30 seconds left.
Get started now.
Yeah.
It's all about getting systems talking to each other. And that's not something you're going to do in the last 2 months before the law, that part of the law kicks in.
Yeah.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you, Derek. Thank you, Constantine. And Derek, thank you especially for providing this forum through the RMA. Thank you, everybody, for attending. We appreciate your interaction with us. We hope this was informative for you. If you've got any questions, you can contact either the three of us at any time. And yes, we will make the presentation that is behind all of this that wasn't really referred to. There it is. Derek scrolling through it. He's got quite a bit of stuff here that will actually be useful referential things for you, that gets into the detail and the weeds that we didn't focus on in this session, because that was not the purpose. But again, thank you all for joining us. There's our contact information, and hope you have a good rest of your day.
Take care, everyone.